Hi again, everybody. I've got another interview for you to consider. Today, we're going to talk about, or this module, we're talking about diversity and the things that we need to know and think about and practice with so that we can really engage with and work on meaningful partnerships with families who maybe aren't the same as us, so whatever that means. So I've got Megan Sapp Nelson is joining us today, and like the other interviews you've been hearing, I have cared for her child. So there's that. But also, Megan, I'm going to switch to you now from the students, but I've learned so much from you in the time that I was, working at the center, but also just in being Facebook friends. Like, you've given me new things to consider, and I might throw some of those things in the conversation too. But first, just tell people who you are and what you want them to know about you.
Sure. My name is Megan Sapp Nelson, and I have a 3-year-old daughter who is a transracial adoptee from foster care. I am also a foster parent of 7 other children, and 2 of those children so my daughter is Black, and 2 of those children were Black, and 1 child was Latino. And so all in that process, I have endeavored to educate myself about being the best possible ally to a child who is not white in my household. And I have spent a lot of time and effort trying to create the best possible environment for my daughter. Mm-hmm. And so that's where my experience comes from. I'm a professor at Purdue in the libraries, but my academic expertise is not in diversity.
Well, no, and what we want is your parental expertise, yes, right, with that, and just your experience, even just things you've learned. So, right. I remember a couple years ago, maybe now, I was reading a new book, and I posted about it on Facebook, as I often do, and it was about allowing gunplay in mm-hmm. early childhood settings and the value that has. And you pointed out for me something I hadn't thought about, which was, when you have a child who's Black, a lot of times they don't have that luxury of being able to play in that way, because it gets them into all kinds of trouble and danger. And so that's just an example of how, as an early childhood educator, I learned from a parent mm-hmm. a perspective that I wasn't considering.
Right.
And I don't know if you remember that or not, but I was just like, oh, of course, yeah, like kids get shot for playing with guns in some neighborhoods. So thank you for that. But also, I just wanted to throw that in. So, I mean, what else has your experience taught you, or do you wish people had known along the way?
So it's an ongoing learning process. So when I obviously learn constantly from the news and from other parents of Black children, particularly Black women and men who are raising Black children. Mm-hmm. I also learn from academics who are studying it, but one of the big things for me is considering what my perspective as a white woman and how that frames how I interact with my environment versus how my child's perspective as a Black girl and then going to be a Black woman will frame her interactions with the environment. So for instance, when I was a child, I interacted with the police as a helper and a friend, and oftentimes in daycare, they will bring in the police as a community helper. And there will be a community helper unit, and the police will come in and the firemen will come in, and it will be treated as a neutral or a positive. Mm-hmm. However, as a Black child and a Black little girl, that is not how I, as a responsible parent should be presenting the police to her necessarily. And the daycare system doesn't necessarily give us heads up ahead of time that they will be presenting that unit to us.
Mm-hmm.
So in the case of our daycare experience, I just got home at night and there were pictures in Tadpole of her interacting with the police, and seeing the police handcuffing the only minority daycare worker instead of the white daycare workers, which someone should have been questioning that decision somewhere along the line.
And that may, that may not have occurred, but having the relationship with you, or just thinking about talking to the employees of color or the families of color, could have prevented that, right? Just having this open partnership where we're each learning from each other.
Right. So I've had to become much more vocal much earlier in my child's education than I really would have ever thought about when I was growing up, about issues that span the gamut, about representation of dolls in the classroom, and the fact that the black dolls did not have pretty clothes, but the white dolls did have pretty clothes. And the presentation of hair on the dolls were not coily curls, but straight hair. So we had a conversation about that. Conversation about skin tone paper and crayons, and the availability of that. That it was available in the daycare, but not in the classroom, as part of
that's not the same thing.
Everyday materials. There's just been a number of conversations that have happened, and having to advocate for the daycare to hire Black women and Black men on the staff. After that daycare had problems with attrition, particularly among their people of color who worked at that daycare, advocating for the fact that Black women and Black men and Latino women and Latino men would be hired back into the staff. And that is a value that I would have, and that representation would be added back into the staff. And then that daycare has a parent Facebook group, and doing a lot of education on that parent Facebook group.
Good for you.
Particularly for white parents, about the impacts their parenting decisions could have on kids of color. So not just with the management of the daycare and the teachers of the daycare, but also with other white parents, about the fact that they need to start educating their children at a young age, as well as my child. I mean, so my child was first called the N-word at the age of 18 months.
Oh no.
So by a child who was probably 8 years old, so it's, white children need educated about race and racial dynamics as young as Black children and Latino children and Indigenous children. And the fact that white parents are not educated to have that conversation and are not comfortable is not an excuse.
Right. And that's where the, well, I don't see color. I just see children. That's where it fails children of color, because if you don't see it, that means you are erasing a big part of that child's identity and life, and robbing the white children of the opportunity to learn about living together. And so as you're talking, Megan, I can hear the brains that aren't here with me. I'm imagining brains clicking, and because certainly 15 years ago, if we had had this conversation, I would have been like, well, that's not my intention. That's not what I'm trying to do. I included Black dolls because I want them to see Black babies. And we have, last week we didn't have any books with children of color, and now we've got 2. So it's, even if your intentions are good, that's why these partnerships with families like yours are so important,
Right.
because you could come to me and say, I was really uncomfortable with the way that situation was handled with the police officer visiting. And I have two choices then. I can be like, oh God, it's Megan again. Um, and laugh in the staff meeting about it.
Right.
Or I can be, okay, I need to learn something here because that didn't occur to me.
Right.
So that listening to families like yours is a tremendous opportunity
Mhm.
if we accept it.
Right. Right.
Can I shift gears on you? And I didn't prepare you for
Absolutely.
this, but one of the other assignments we're doing in this module is to read articles about diverse families. And one of the articles we're going to be looking at is about adopted
Mhm.
families. So do you have, because that's another kind of diversity that we don't
It is.
consider.
Mhm.
So can you talk a little bit about what you feel like
Yes.
people should?
So I don't share my daughter's story in public, but I can generally tell you that any child who comes from foster care will have some sort of trauma, and it is it is important to listen to families
Mhm.
and get their perspective on the child's behavior in the classroom, particularly when the child is from an underrepresented minority background, because I'm sure you've recognized and heard, read literature about the prison, the school to prison pipeline. It starts in daycare,
Preschool,
starts in
yeah,
early
preschool.
childhood education. And children who are Black may be expressing trauma in your classroom, and it's being read as misbehavior. It's being read as something that is worth that child being suspended for,
Yeah.
when it is actually the expression of life experiences that they have already experienced.
And honestly, uh, brain development that has
Mhm.
been impacted by those early experiences.
Right.
So I could look at you and your husband and say, oh, but she has such a wonderful, loving family now. She should be fine. But the fact of the matter is, the trauma that she brings is
Mm-hmm.
still hardwired, and we have
Right.
to do some
Right.
work.
I will tell a story from daycare. So my daughter is very social. She is an extrovert and she loves all of her friends.
Uh-huh.
But one of the residual issues from her early trauma is that she has to know where all of her loved people are at all times and make sure that they are okay. And it results in behavior in the classroom looking like she can't focus on anything and she has to be checking on people all the time. So she's wandering from station to station to station to station. And so in the parents teacher conference, the comment of the teacher was, well, we would like to see her focusing on her own station because we're just not, we think that she's behind developmentally. And it's like, well, she can play for half an hour at a time at home,
Mhm.
focusing on her own play.
Yeah.
What you are seeing that she's going from one friend to another friend to another friend to another friend to another friend? They're like, oh yeah, that's what you're seeing. Well, that is not that she
Right.
cannot do it. What you are seeing is that she is manifesting anxiety that all of her friends are not in one place, and so she has to continuously check up on everybody to make sure that they're okay.
Right.
That's a residual of trauma.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of thing that the parents can tell you, but
Right.
as a teacher, you may not know.
Sure. And I mean, putting aside the idea that it's a developmental problem
Right.
that a 3, 4 year old
Right. I know, but
doesn't want to stay
they were
with their
saying we would
station.
really like her to stay in her own place
Putting
because
aside that expectation, just
right.
did they stop and wonder, why is this happening? Or did they talk to a previous teacher and say,
Yeah, I don't
who could
know.
have shared what you've told? There's just a whole process in
Yeah.
that. And when we talk about parent conferences, that will become part of it too, is thinking about what you're about to present from the family's perspective and
Mhm.
filtering it through what you've heard a family talk to
Mhm.
you about, or a parent ask you about or share with you.
Right.
So it's a complicated thing. It's
Mhm.
parent partnership relationships with families is much more than talking at the pickup and drop off time and sending you a note or the app report and expecting you to do everything
Right.
that we say. That we call it a partnership, but we completely exclude one set of the partnership sometimes.
Right. And one thing that I would say that I've had real frustrations with multiple centers about has been adverse childhood experiences training. Because for kids from trauma background, and this is not just kids from foster care, this is any kids that have been exposed to trauma, which we're in the middle of a pandemic. So that's going to be a significant chunk of the kids who are going to enter early childhood education from the next 4 years. They will have an adverse childhood experiences score, and the higher the score, the more likely you are to see trauma being acted out in the classroom, which is going to impact the level of maturity that you can expect from the students. And over again, I walk into early childhood education centers and ask them, have they had training on this? And they say, oh no, we haven't had any training on that. And it's unreasonable to expect it of us because we have so little time in our year for professional development. And I don't consider that an adequate answer.
Nor should you. No, you really shouldn't. And so for anyone who's, anyone in the class who now is wondering what ACE scores are and adverse child experiences are, let me know, because I would love to share with you. And you can't sticker chart or time out that trauma out of the human being that you're working.
Especially if a parent pulls you aside and discloses, my child has an ACE score of 4 or an ACE score of 6, you should know that you can't do a sticker chart. You can't do a timeout. You're going to have to do a time in. You're going to have to reinforce through things like, we're going to do a redo. And we're going to teach you what the expected behavior is, right? Because that's the only thing that's going to work for that child. So that's the sort of thing that, unless you are willing to take that information in from the parent, unless you've had that baseline education of, this is what an ACE score is, this is what trauma is going to do, this is why they're developmentally behind by half their age, that what that means for normal, I don't know, discipline, but it's not really discipline because you're not teaching them anything. Then you're not going to have a success with the child. I've been very frustrated with childhood centers.
I'm not at all surprised. I mean, I hate to say it, but I know that's what's happening. Trauma is a buzzword in the field. We hear it, we read about it. There might be a workshop at a conference, but we don't go deep into what it means for our everyday practice. And the word trauma, we interpret different ways. It doesn't have to be, it could be the accumulation of small adverse effects. It could be some catastrophic life event. But sometimes it's, not having the needs met that you needed at a certain time for safety or shelter or relationship. There's it's a whole spectrum, and we need to be better about it. That's for sure.
I will say that in my daughter's case, I'm trying to tell the story without disclosing the details. The daycare teacher withheld a need in a way that mirrored the withholding of a need that she had when she was in her early trauma, and it triggered her significantly. And it ended up becoming a whole thing. Like every night before bedtime, she would be like, this teacher said that she wouldn't play with me because she was triggering her, right? Like this teacher was doing this teacher was hurting me, this teacher was going to withdraw from me, which was triggering her over and over. We had to meet with the daycare center leader. We had to come up with ways to reassure her. Like it's when daycare center teachers revert back to like traditional discipline, like withholding affection, withholding time with the child, you have no idea what you're triggering.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we shouldn't know those things anyway because they're not effective to change whatever behavior, but also because we don't know what's under the surface. It's that whole iceberg analogy.
And when you layer it upon the systematic racism that leads to the school to prison pipeline, where you have Black boys and girls who are more likely to be suspended because they are triggered by those responses to those traditional discipline techniques. And then they're kicked out of school, and then they get used to the idea that they fail over and over.
And that there's no place for them.
There's no place for them. They won't be successful at school. Then they act out more.
Yeah. And they learn that early, that whole idea that adults don't like me and I'm not good at school. You can learn that at 2 years old.
You can. You can learn it at 2 years. That's when you internalize it at 2 years and 3 years old, because that's when you're learning how the world works.
Right. Yeah. I could do this all day, Megan. But the students probably need to.
I know, they're probably getting bored.
Yeah. So I'm gonna close with the same question I've asked the other. It's all been moms that I've interviewed so far. If there was like just one thing that it was really important for someone who was caring for your daughter to know, what would that be? I mean, you've just told us a lot.
I've just told you a lot. The thing that has been key for people who are caring for our daughter is the technique of redos for, I hate to call it discipline, but I mean, when she does something wrong, we say, okay, now it's time for a redo. And we literally walk her through practice of the expected behavior.
Yeah.
That way it is not that she is bad. It is that she is learning. Learners get to make mistakes, and learners get to practice until they do it right. Right. So you get to do a redo.
Yeah.
And that's really important for my daughter, because she, well, I mean, even if somebody in our house raises our voice, she melts down into tears, right? Like she can't handle the stress of a traditional disciplinary tactic. She can handle a redo where we do it side by side with her.
Yeah. And she's not alone as she's learning in that process.
Yeah, exactly. It's just practice.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Megan. I appreciate you giving us your time and so much of your personal self and story. I'm really grateful for that. I think this will be really important for the students to hear. And for you students now, well, by this time you know the drill, but make sure you check out the assignment instructions for your reflection piece on this video, and just let me know if you have any questions or want more information about anything, because Megan, you gave us so much. And we'll go from there. All right. Thanks again, Megan.
Thanks.